Good afternoon from London, but I think we have lots of people joining us from Canada today, unsurprisingly. So, good morning to all of you who are joining us from there. The webinar will begin very shortly. We'll just take a few minutes for people to join the call. So, good afternoon again from London. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant. I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, which works with civil servants and public servants all around the world. I think we have people from different countries joining us here today, but because of the topic that we are focused on, we definitely have people from the civil service, the public sector in Canada, and also I think we have some private sector partners with us here today, potential suppliers to government as well. So a big welcome to all of you. Um, in terms of today's topic, the Canadian general election is only 4 days away now. It's going to be held on April the 28th on Monday. Right now, I think civil servants, some of you even here that are on the call today, will be working on what plans you might be looking at for new ministers who are going to be appointed in the election, and for suppliers and potential partners to government. You might be thinking about how you can use that post-election period as an opportunity to support the next government's decision-making and transformation initiatives. So in our conversation today, we'll be looking at things like the context of this election, the key issues for the incoming Prime Minister, the main contenders and their differences in kind of policy and ideology, some international lessons for public sector reform, and then we'll also cover some of Global Government Forum's upcoming events in Canada, which might help you to get alongside some policymakers and understand what the new government's priorities are. I have two great experts with me here today. In a moment, I'm going to introduce both of them and we will kick off a conversation. But this is just to say we definitely want today to be a discussion, a conversation with you, our audience. So from any point from now on, please do message in your questions and your comments. You should see somewhere on the device you are using a Q&A button. You can use that Q&A button, as I say, at any point from now to message in your comments and questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can throughout the course of our conversation today. We won't wait until right at the end. So do send in a question if you think of something as you hear our panelists speaking. So, in terms of our two fantastic experts today, we're joined by Michael Vernick, who is one of Canada's most experienced and influential public sector leaders. Michael has a distinguished career spanning nearly 40 years in public service, and it culminated when Michael was the 23rd Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to the Cabinet from 2016 to 2019. Michael was also a key public servant at the Privy Council office during 3 changes of Prime Minister. So I think it's safe to say that he really is well placed to help us through this conversation today. In October 2021, Michael's book, Governing Canada, A Guide to the Tradecraft of Politics, was published. I highly recommend you all go and read that if you haven't done already. And in his current role as the Jaroslawski Chair at the University of Ottawa, Michael now provides advisory services and mentorship to emerging leaders and to new generations of students. And then we also have with us here today Richard Johnston, who is the executive editor for Global Government Forum. Richard is he oversees the title's content across digital publishing, in-depth research reports, and in-person and online events. And across all of these platforms, Richard works to provide analysis and insights for our audience of public servants all around the world. And Richard has worked in public policy journalism throughout his entire career. He's worked on GGF research, which has been covered in titles including the Financial Times, the Ottawa Citizen, Fed Manager, the Mandarin, the I newspaper, and BBC Radio 4's PM programme. So I'm sure you'll agree it's great that we have these two fantastic experts with us here today. And as I say, we're going to talk about all of those issues, but we want this to be a conversation with you, our audience. So please do get your questions and your comments coming in. But now I'm going to kick off because I know our time is limited. So, Michael, great to have you here. I'm going to come over to you. And I think just to kick off the conversation with a bit of a scene setter, really, I think it's safe to say this has been quite a peculiar election for several reasons, not least because nobody thought it'd be happening now. I think most people thought this election wouldn't be happening until October. So, could you just give us, from where you're sat over there, a sense of the context and why this particular election has been so unique?
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your interest, and thank you, Siobhan, for a very generous introduction. I think it was always going to be an election year, as you said, and in some sense, public servants and others have been anticipating and thinking about an election coming this year. But it's turned out to be quite a surprising one, and it'll make great fodder for after-action analysis and instant books that will be rushing to publishers after it's all over. A couple of things sort of stand out apart from the polling and the horse race numbers, which are obviously quite striking. We are going to have a new prime minister. I think whether it's Poilievre or Carney, we're going to have somebody who's new to the role and new to the job. It's the first time in more than 30 years that the incumbent prime minister isn't on the ballot. I don't count Carney as an incumbent. He's only been there 40 years, basically. And one of his favorite lines is, "I just got here." So essentially, we're going to have a new prime minister, learning the job as they start up. It's an odd election in the conventional political sense because effectively the Liberal government is going for a fourth mandate after 9 years in power, and ordinarily that would be an extraordinarily difficult thing to attempt. It's also a case where a successor to a long-standing PM is trying to represent, both continuity and change, and that usually doesn't go well, both here and in other countries. You think of Paul Martin after Jean Chrétien or Kim Campbell after Brian Mulroney. It's very hard for the successor to establish whether they're a fresh face or whether they're continuity of the brand. And everything has sort of changed in terms of the overall context. I think 6 months ago, had the election taken place, it might have been about inflation and carbon tax and housing and affordability and struggles of young families to get by. It might be immigration. Any number of issues might have dominated the election. Certainly, the Conservatives wanted to frame it as about affordability. But everything changed on January 20th with Donald Trump taking office, and it's extraordinary to think that was only 95 days ago. So much has happened and happens every week and every day. What's happened in Canada, much of the audience will be familiar with, but it's hard to convey to people outside of Canada, is the psychology of it all, the shock, the sense of betrayal, the sense of existential danger, to our survival and sovereignty as a country, has really been quite palpable and really the dominant sort of thing in the mood of the country, which seems to have settled into a kind of quiet resistance, a sort of we're going to get through this, elbows up, more desire to resist rather than appease, certainly, although there's certainly issues that come up in terms of tactics. So whatever the election was going to be about, now it's essentially drifted into a plebiscite about which of the two major party leaders is best suited to deal with Donald Trump and the ripples that Donald Trump is creating in geopolitics, in the economy and financial markets, and certainly in terms of the Canadian economy. In a sense, it's all happening in real time. The tariffs go up, go down, things happen, and so the convention of restraint has certainly been stress tested during this election because Mr. Carney's and some of his ministers have had to govern while campaigning and sort of walk that line. Going back to the politics of it, it's really quite noticeable that the smaller parties have just been crushed in a sort of a polarization to the two big old parties. If there ever was a drift to sort of niche, smaller parties representing special interests, that's basically been thrown into reverse. And the two old parties who have been around for 150 years are
Mm.
going to harvest something like 80% of the vote on Monday, which is
Wow.
really quite remarkable.
Yeah.
It's mostly been about the two leaders. You don't hear much about the supporting cast. I don't think it's easy for local candidates to really break through the national narrative. Um, and I would say, just in closing, it's largely been policy free. You know, I mean, people have gone through the motions of promises and platforms were released last week. We go through the pretense of costing the promises and the manifestos and so on. It's a ritual we like to go through, but really it's been about, a contest between the two leaders, sort of a contest between change and stability and trust and very much kind of policy-free election compared to some of the previous ones. So, I think whoever wins, they're going to have a reckoning with reality when the election's behind them. All sorts of policy and financial and fiscal issues are going to come crashing into their in basket.
Yeah. And we'll come on to what the new Prime Minister will kind of have to deal with on day one in a moment. But just we might have we probably do have some non-Canadians on the call. So just picking up on what you said there about it kind of all changed with Trump. Um, could you just give us a sense of how big that change has been? So you said this is kind of the fourth, it would be the fourth time the Liberal Party would be coming into power if they win the election. Am I right in thinking that before Trump, that looked like a very tall order for them to get back in, and that the polls, how have the polls changed during this period?
Well, I think, the governing Liberals were in deep trouble last year. They were starting to lose by-elections in places that had been party strongholds. The brand of Justin Trudeau, which was so fresh and positive in 2015, 2016, had become sort of worn out. There was a bit of a tired government syndrome, and certainly people had seen enough of Justin Trudeau, especially during the pandemic and after that. The election might well have been, a referendum on Mr. Trudeau. The party might have tried to save itself by, changing leaders at the last minute. That's been done in Canada before and in other countries. Whether that would have worked or not, we'll never really know. So the Conservatives are very much trying to attach Mr. Carney to the Trudeau brand, the Trudeau legacy. They go to some trouble to describe this as a fourth Liberal term. They try to brand, Trudeau's prime ministership as a lost decade, and so on. And they're trying to attach Mr. Carney to Trudeau as much as possible. And I think Mr. Carney's team presumably are trying to, carve out some independent space and say, it's a fresh team and a fresh approach.
Mm.
There are attributes of the Liberal brand which are positive. I don't want to sound that it's all negative. So they're trying a very difficult act of sort of keeping the brand and the positive parts of the Liberal record while presenting themselves as sort of a new under new management. But as I keep going back to, it's really become a reaction to Trump.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm sure we'll get questions about Trump and kind of why this has happened the way it's happened, but we will move on to those. But Richard, I just want to come to you. So Michael there has set out what's unique about this election in the Canadian context. There are other elections going on around the world, not least in Australia. So are there any comparisons that can be drawn? Is this kind of a pattern that we're seeing in other countries as well?
Thanks, Siobhan, and hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining. I mean, just to take I think the answer to your question is yes, but just to take an initial step back to last year, where there was the quite remarkable trend in elections where the incumbents in every single one of the 10 major countries that held elections last year lost vote share. That was the first time this had ever happened. It was monitored by a global research project called ParlGov, and we saw it in the UK, in the US, and in France, and other countries too. So there was a very clear trend last year that I think it's kind of fair to say that it was pressures around inflation that were being felt around the world, and that was leading to incumbents suffering at the polls. And yeah, Michael just mentioned the kind of anticipation that this would have been part of the context of the Canadian election this year too. But I think that trend culminated in Donald Trump's election, and it is Donald Trump's time as US president seems to have had another identifiable electoral effect. We've already touched on the how it seems to have helped the Liberal Party in Canada, and the Australian example is very similar ahead of their election. Again, the incumbent left of centre Labour Party seems to have had a bounce from the impact of a Trump administration, and the opposition right of centre party seems to have lost some ground. The figures in both countries seem to have moved in sort of began to move it earlier this year, maybe February, March time, when the impact of the tariffs or the volatility of the tariffs and the wider kind of geopolitics began to be felt, and yeah, it seems like there was a kind of rally to the incumbents effect, at least in the polling so far. We will of course see how it shakes out on the day itself, but it's not a universal factor. Yeah, in Germany, for example, the incumbent centre-left coalition lost in February, and the populist AfD party made some electoral progress. But then even here, the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, of the centre-right, has spoken about a new era of European defence and the need to, in his words, achieve independence from the US. And I think he said that he could never have foreseen himself making such statements. So it's really interesting that I think countries and their voters are taking the US seriously in its disengagement from, you know, areas of geopolitics, and indeed, as Michael said, in its language around Canada. People are taking them seriously, and I think that's going to be the kind of identifiable trend in the elections we see this month and probably beyond.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that, Rick, because obviously in Canada, it's very obvious why Canadians would rail against, I think, the language coming out of Trump and the things that he's been saying. In other countries like Australia, maybe that's not quite so clear why people are, what you said there, maybe the impact of the tariffs and the impact on potential impact on economies is the thing that's doing it. But it's not quite the same situation, is it?
No, no, absolutely, and it probably is a slight kind of rally to the flag, rally to the
Yeah.
incumbents effect that you're seeing there. There's also, the fact that it's centre left parties that are governing, and in some what in the Canadian and Australian examples it is, and that sometimes when the centre right parties have attached themselves to or been seen to be close to America on the sort of culture war issues and things like that, that is leading to kind of some sort of blowback when they then seem to be attached to things like tariffs and the global wider instability. That's seems to be one of the things that's moving voters to incumbent left of centre parties.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Michael, bringing it back to Canada then. So essentially there are two main contenders for this election. And as you say, you know that one of those two will be the new Prime Minister, a very new Prime Minister, even though Mark Carney has been there for, I think, just over a month or 2 months now in post. So essentially you'll have a new Prime Minister. That new Prime Minister is going to inherit a whole load of challenges because there are lots of things facing governments all around the world. So can you just give us a sense of, regardless of who gets in, on day one, what will be the kind of issues that they will have to deal with? What will be their immediate priorities, do you think?
Well, I think top of mind will be the trade war, I would just reinforce, if underline from Richard's comments. I mean, it is so existential for Canada. Trade is a big part of GDP. It's more than a quarter, and 80% of our trade is with the United States. So a lot of jobs and industries, are exposed in a way, much more so than in the UK or Europe. And our defense and security relationship is very much about, North American continental defense, the airspace, the waters, our NATO commitments, and so on. So it is so woven into how Canada works that it, but I think it's mostly the psychology of, our buddy, our neighbor, our friend is suddenly turned on us. And so there's a sense of, this 51st state language is not funny. It's quite worrying. Donald Trump's not threatening to annex Australia. He is threatening to annex Canada. So that's why it's different. So I think that's the first thing. I mean, we'll see another week or two of zigzagging and hot and cold, by Trump and the administration. But first and foremost, the trade war and sort of the implications of the tariffs. We have an enormous auto sector in central Canada, which is very exposed, a lot of jobs and a lot of communities, but there, it'll start to be felt at the level of communities and firms and industries and so on.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I mean, the in basket is going to start very much on the international side. It just strangely enough lines up that way. Canada is hosting the G7 summit in Alberta in June. And there's a very important NATO summit at the end of June where all of the leaders are going to have to go sort of, almost a pledging session of how quickly are they going to up their game on defense and security issues. So I think those will blow back into budget making and the fiscal situation in Canada and so on. Parliament hasn't sat since Christmas. Parliament was prorogued by Mr. Trudeau. So there's a bit of a backlog of orphan legislation from the last Parliament. Mr. Carney or Poilievre will have to decide, what to salvage from that, keep some of the bills, modify them, or drop them all entirely. But there's some big pieces of legislative work. Plus, you'll have to sort of carve out at least the opening moves of your own legislative agenda and implementation of some of those manifesto promises. But very quickly, as I alluded to earlier, all those old issues will come back. There is a sense of a severe housing shortage and difficulties of young families with, acquiring housing. Healthcare is always an issue in Canada. Wait times in the health service is a perennial. We were into a very big discussion about immigration levels and the ability of the country to absorb the kind of flows we've seen over the last few years. Indigenous issues, environment issues, like it'll all come in. There'll be vacancies to fill, appointments to make. We talk about transition, and really is that transition to governing, has to happen fairly quickly. And then some of the longer wave things. I mean, before the election, Canada was having a conversation about its economy and its economic performance, and there's a very broad consensus that spans the spectrum of parties that there's something wrong. There's a malaise in the economy. We have productivity issues. We have growth issues. We're going to have to up our game on productivity and growth. Now that is coupled with a sense of we'll have to be more resilient, more autonomous, able to do more things for ourselves. And then, for the policy nerds, I mean, all the big drivers are still there. AI is still sweeping through, the economy and society. Climate warming has not stopped for these elections. And all of the geopolitical issues from Ukraine to Gaza to other places have impacts on Canada. Canada has a very diverse population with diaspora from just about everywhere in the world, as the largest Ukrainian population outside of the Ukraine. So always international issues come into the domestic agenda. There was a psychology building before the election that big decisions and bold action are needed. Different views about what that means, but a sense of, that old cliche, never waste a crisis. And
Yeah.
I think there is both an expectation and perhaps permission for the next government, to be bolder and to break through some of the sort of timidity and incrementalism, the playing it safe sort of politics. If there was ever a time where a government could sort of, break eggs and make an omelet, it's probably this year.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And on that, we have a question coming in which relates to all of that. As you said there, all of those issues, in a way, are going to become even harder as Canada starts to look to build its resilience and become more kind of independent itself. So Nakash Hall has said, if 80% of export industry is dependent on the USA, how will Canada adjust to minimize the risk of downfall in the economy? So essentially, how is it going to do all of these things while at the same time trying to adjust to this different relationship with the US?
Well, it's a very good question, but I think it's one of those known unknowns. I mean, essentially, the tariffs are going to be paid by American importers and customers. It's the lumber they will import to build their houses will be more expensive. The potash they buy, to turn into fertilizer for their farmers will become more expensive. It's for the economists to model, how much sales will drop. Americans will continue to buy our stuff. It'll be more expensive for them, and they may try to, shift patterns and diversify who they buy from. But if they're putting big tariffs on everybody, I think that the watchword of the next 6 months at least, and perhaps longer, is just uncertainty. So, if you're on the board of a company trying to make investment in hiring and location decisions, it's very, very difficult. And I think the worry about the Canadian economy is not so much the short-term impact, that the price of X will go up to American customers, or American goods coming into Canada if we retaliate. It's this sort of chill on making decisions, making investment decisions, and where would you build your next car making plant, and where would and so on. So and we just can't know now, where all the ripples are going to take us.
And do you think you mentioned this really deep sense of shock and betrayal that Canadians have in the way that America has treated them, which I think for countries like us is we're watching it. It's quite hard for us to be able to actually understand how deep those feelings go. But do you think that whichever candidate wins, whoever gets in, the public will grace them a slightly longer honeymoon period than maybe normal because of that? So they might be able to take some of these big, bold decisions, even if people take a hit in the short term, because they understand that that new prime minister is dealing with this really exceptional circumstance.
Well, it's a bit speculative, but I would think that the grace period will be longer. Normally, what happens is, the people used to call it a honeymoon effect after an election. It starts to wear off very quickly. You take decisions and you annoy people and you displease people and you disappoint your supporters, and the wear and tear of governing takes its toll very, very quickly. But I think in this case, assuming we have a reasonably clear outcome in Parliament, I mean, that's a little footnote perhaps, there's probably more runway, and there's more of a spirit of cooperation between the federal government, the provinces, and the municipalities. I mean, every important question in Canada is affected by federalism. There's no important issue that doesn't require cooperation between the levels of government. And right now there is a sort of Team Canada solidarity. We saw it during the pandemic. We saw it during the NAFTA negotiations with Trump in 2018. That won't last forever, and undoubtedly the levels of government will start snapping at each other, and normal service will resume. But depending on what Trump does, I think we'll probably have a fairly long runway for the government.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. So, Richard, how do you think other countries then are going to be looking at Canada and viewing, the different outcomes of this election? Will they make a big difference to countries and the kind of new alliances and relationships that countries are building with each other?
It's excuse me. It's a very interesting question. I think it's very, very interesting that Michael raised that some of the early issues that the new Prime Minister will have to deal with are the international relations and big set piece events. If we park the US for the moment, I think if presuming that either of the likely candidates for Prime Minister want to have close relationships with their other G7 peers, it will be in everyone's interest to make it happen. We've seen the impact of the tariffs and the uncertainty from the US and the geopolitics leading to a lot of conversations around increased European solidarity and defense and security arrangements. We saw Mark Carney prioritize some international trips to France and the UK in his first week as Prime Minister, with the aim of kind of strengthening those economic and security partnerships. So I think that there will be a lot of willingness to have those strong bilateral ties between certainly France, Canada, and the UK to pick the kind of the three with perhaps the closest historical alignments. There is interesting questions obviously around the forums for that. If the US are in the G7, where is there a way that Canada can be part of discussions with the European allies around Ukraine, for example, and the correct forums for that? I wonder if there'll be a bit of innovation there, and ways that new kind of structures can be built. Both of the parties' manifestos, Conservatives and the Liberals, do mention strengthening alliances and ties with countries that share our values. And the Conservative one does mention as well kind of defunding some international institutions like UNRWA, the UN agency in Palestine, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, for not holding or not upholding Canada's interests and values. And likewise, the Liberal Manifesto very much mentions building alliances to protect sovereignty, and looking to build and leverage closer relationships with both the Commonwealth and Francophone nations, and both continue to pledge to support Ukraine as well. So I think there could be quite a lot of kind of shared priorities regardless in the international relations sphere, regardless of who does become Prime Minister. But yeah, I think that there's still an unresolved question on how you make it happen, how you build the structures to make these things routine rather than exception.
Thanks, Richard. We've got some good questions coming in, and they do relate to my next question I'm going to ask, which I will do, and then I'll come back to the questions from Scott and Bruce because they lead on from it nicely. I wanted to move on to what's been said about kind of government itself, the role of the state, public sector reform, those kind of issues. So, Michael, just you've been here before, you've overseen kind of 3 changes of Prime Minister. So just give us a sense of what will civil servants be doing right now, but also what, if anything, have Carney or Poilievre said about the role of the state and about the way they might approach civil service and public sector reform?
It's a very good question, and if people are trying to read the tea leaves, to use an old metaphor, I mean, what it clearly indicates is a very busy year for public servants, whether you're in policy shops or operations, delivery, transactions, defense and security agencies, economic agencies, I think it'll be a period of flat out hard work and a lot on the go. and no prospect of relief in sight. Like there's no obvious point where we'll say, you know, we'll reach a steady state, or we may be living with uncertainty and adaptability for a decade. You know, so we'll have to at some point pay attention to resilience and recovery and sort of how to sustain that capacity. The competition for attention and focus will be intense. At the end of the day, there's only so much room at the cabinet table for those 25 or 30 people to take decisions. And so I think, you know, the central agencies and others will be trying to manage the flow of issues and decisions to get the most out of, you know, the decision-making engine. Policy shops will be stretched. A lot will depend on the sort of overall fiscal framing. I mean, it's fairly clear that a long period of abundance and growth is over. We're going to see some period of restraint and cuts, you know, milder with the Liberals than the Conservatives, at least, you know, going from their manifestos. But I think both of them have talked about efficiency and leanness and sort of getting to a smaller, flatter, more compact public service. But I would say, you know, the public service itself hasn't really been a campaign issue. There's no real sign that either party has a clear plan or agenda. There are a few things in the manifestos I'd call sprinkles. You know, they throw in a few bits and pieces, you know, that, but nothing that looks like a very serious sort of program for public sector reform. It more derives from the spending, you know, the sense that there'll be, you know, the Liberals have actually said there'll be a spending review of some sort. We've seen that in the past. We'll see what it takes shape. And the focus has been largely on the body count, how many public servants and can we get to fewer of them? No real conversation about which ones, which functions, which locations, which programs, and so on. So, and, you know, a bit of lip service to efficiency and productivity. But I would say that basically whoever comes in, you know, you can look at it as they have a blank page and they can take the public service where they want to, or you can take it more, you know, they don't really have an agenda or plan for public sector reform. They'll inherit a fair bit, you know, of things that were going on. I don't want to, you know, there were agendas in play, the digital ambition agenda of the previous government. There was a task force on productivity. AI is happening whether they like it or not, and so on. So in a sense, there'll be a public service agenda that will come at them. The question mark is whether they want to drive it in a more, you know, mindful, proactive, top-down way or not. And I think we just don't know at this point.
Thanks, Michael. And we do have a question about AI, which actually, Richard, I'm going to come to you on that in a moment. But Michael, building on what you've just said there, so Bruce Mannion has said, asked you specifically, that the party platforms of both the contenders still call for significant deficits over the next 5 years. How do you see that factoring into a period of uncertainty over the next term for the Canadian economy? And also building on what you just said there about cuts and the fact they're focused on essentially just reducing numbers and very little else. Bruce has said there are rumours coming out of the right wing of a possible Doge-like exercise to cut the federal public service. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we don't really know what the Conservatives have in mind, other than, you know, they start with a predilection for smaller government, you know, and that derives, you know, from legitimate, you know, political platform of smaller government, less involvement in the economy and the society, government doing fewer things, and therefore you can have, you know, a smaller workforce. I hope that they still would care about the quality of service delivery and internal functions and productivity. Small government can still be effective government, so, you know, that they will probably turn to some of these issues. You know, the fiscal point is the important one, in a sense that, you know, the deficit's just spending minus revenues, and you know, what the politicians have not been candid about is they're going to need more revenue. They can't run a social democratic state with a robust defense budget reaching 2 to 3% of GDP on the current revenue basis. The math doesn't work. So, you know, they're not going to talk in the last weeks of a campaign about future tax increases, but, you know, your choices are borrow the money, which is what the Germans are doing, or you have to raise taxes to pay for it. There's just, or cut something else, you know, and there's sort of a lot of vague language about finding efficiencies and we'll cut government in order to free up money. everybody who's been involved in this knows it's much harder to do that than it sounds, and so on. So, I mean, my message is, at some point they'll have to be candid with Canadians that this is a time for sacrifice and higher taxes are on the agenda.
Thanks. And talking of being candid, Richard, I mean, this is something that here in the UK, I think Keir Starmer, when he came in, had a similar kind of challenge and has been quite candid, I think people would say, in terms of some of those trade-offs. Is there anything that a new Canadian PM could learn from the way people like Keir Starmer have approached reform, or maybe other countries as well?
Yeah, I think that there definitely is. I mean, just to pick up on that the point in the last question about the idea of a Canadian Doge, we're there's a lot of frustration amongst politicians around the world. It's pretty universal about the performance of government and of the state. We've seen how that has manifested itself in the US. But in the UK, Keir Starmer, since he came into government, has been quite vocal about the his dissatisfaction with what the state is delivering. He gave a speech on innovation and trying to make the government more agile, where he said that there are parts of the state that see their job as blocking the government from doing the very things that it was elected to do. You can't justify that. I think there is kind of frustration at process, at bureaucracy, at legal challenge, that has built up in a lot of democracies, and who kind of contrast themselves with more undemocratic regimes who are able to do things at pace. So in the UK, there's definitely been a move to streamlining process of consultation. The UK government has made a big play on building infrastructure and building housing, and has been also clear that that means some processes, some planning applications and things like that will need to be sped up. And I think from a Canadian point of view, again, looking at the manifesto, there's kind of similar frustrations in the Conservative manifesto. There's mention of I think trimming bloated bureaucracy and not services, and introducing some restrictions on public service hiring, reducing the size of the public service, as Michael said, by only replacing 2 in every 3 departing employees. Again, the UK has had recruitment freezes under the last government and is having headcount reductions still under this one. And then, yeah, the Liberal government has put great store in the Liberal manifesto, sorry, has put great store in the value of digital transformation, and I know we can come on to that question in a moment. But I do think it's really striking where kind of when you see countries that are governed by different people from different kind of ideological traditions, they are all sharing frustrations at the moment, and I think that's really telling, and something that kind of as Michael says, it's perhaps time to be a bit bolder in some of the actions around reform, and that doesn't mean chainsaws, but it does mean something.
I was going to say, you can be bold in terms of reform, and you can even aim for a smaller state if that's what you want, but you don't necessarily have to do it the way that Doge has approached it. So I'm sure we'll get more questions about that. There's lots of questions coming in, especially for you, Michael, on some of these. But I do want to come back to Scott's question, which was, how should Canadian public servants prepare for a government that is more focused on leveraging AI? And I guess given what we're saying about all of these challenges, and given that one of the challenges is how do you embrace new technologies and AI, but the flip side of that is AI could be one of the ways in which you are able to meet these challenges, because it will just improve efficiency, productivity, reduce errors and frauds, and all those kind of issues. So To what extent, Richard, I'll come to you first on this one because I know, again, in the UK, but other countries as well, some of the world leaders are placing a lot of emphasis on the role that AI will play in helping to meet these significant challenges that they're facing.
Yeah, absolutely. And at Global Government Forum, we just last month held our innovation conference, and it was striking to me from the sessions I was able to attend. You were in a lot more of them than I was, Siobhan, but the thinking of where AI can be used in government and the thinking of how it can be applied to solve specific problems had kind of developed quite a lot compared to similar conversations 12 months ago. There's a lot of more thinking about use cases,
Mm,
about where it can be applied in processes both internal and citizen facing, and quite a lot of work that's actually being got on and done with. So I would expect to see a similar step change uh, in the
mm,
months ahead. Um, there's again mention of AI in the party platforms, and the Liberal Party has talking about establishing a dedicated office of government transformation, which sounds a bit similar to changes that the Labour government made in the UK
mm,
when they came in, moving the central government digital service out of the cabinet office and into one of the departments, the Department for Innovation, and kind of re-energizing that as well. So there's a lot of ambition around AI, and yes, from a time when, as you say, I think politicians were hopeful that it was the magic box that would solve all their problems, without really perhaps putting in the thinking about how the processes of government would work
mm.
and could be catalyzed by AI. I think that thinking has came on um, an awful lot, and I know the Canadian government has. Just before the election was called, published its first AI strategy for the federal public service, and I think that's going to provide the basis for kind of looking at its deployment in the federal government. How should public servants prepare? I mean, make sure that you are that your skills that you're capable of using AI when these tools are made available. There's a kind of approved AI tools I know a lot of public servants have access to. Make use of them. Be confident in what you're asking of it, and look at your at your processes. We always
Mm.
talk about in Global Government Forum, there's often governments are digitizing pre-existing processes, but there's more benefit to be had if they could go back to first principles and say, actually, this is what we would like the AI to do.
Yeah.
That is, of course, difficult, and it is perhaps one of those difficult questions that Michael alluded to, where there might perhaps be room for a little bit more kind of creativity in the decision making. But that's where I think that the standard of that kind of thinking has really improved in the last kind of year or so.
Thanks, Richard. And Michael, I will ask you for if you want to add anything on AI in particular, but we've got a question which I think links perfectly to this, and it's coming
Mm.
from Matt Page. And Matt has, because Richard there mentioned kind of skills, make sure you're skilled up, make sure you understand, that level of digital literacy that everybody really needs. And Matt Page has said, "Hi, Michael. Claims have been made that each Canadian family is paying approximately $1,400 annually for consulting services across federal departments, and that these services should be reduced or eliminated. Based on your experience within the government, do you believe departments and agencies can realistically function without the support of these types of professional services?" So I think that fits in really
Sure.
nicely to this whole conversation about technology and how prepared
Yeah.
civil servants are.
Okay, so let me start from there. No, of course not. The workflows drive this, and there are only three ways to get work done. One is permanent civil servants, the other is temporary civil servants, and the third is outside contractors. And what you're looking for is the right mix. There is a reaction in Canada that the mix has gone too far towards consultancies and contractors. And all of the parties have said that they will cut back on that. They have not said that they will invest in training and upskilling of public servants yet, but that is a corollary if you want to bring the work in-house. And I think there's always a role for outside contractors as the efficient way of getting a project done, or if you want to bring in the leading edge expertise on customer relationships or information management or queue management, or how AI can enhance, particular professions, whether they're lawyers or financial, that's not sitting around inside the public service. It's sitting around in the consultancies who work with the big private sector firms, the banks, the telcos, the airlines. And there is a role for transmission of that knowledge and expertise into the public service, perhaps in a way where you build capacity and don't create long-term dependencies. So there's smarter ways to use consultancies, for sure. I have to interject one Canadian point, though, just building on Richard, which is a lot of the public sector services people care about, healthcare, education, courts, policing, are delivered by provincial and local governments. And so the use cases about AI are largely playing out in provincial and local government. And there's not a lot the federal government can do to drive that. They can get out of the way or they can create incentives. But some of the most interesting issues will be being played out in provincial health ministries and so on. I think the thing about AI is it's already here. If you opened your phone with Face ID, that's AI. If you have Copilot in the corner of your Microsoft suite, that's AI. If you use Google Translate when you're traveling, that's AI. Facial recognition at the airports, that's AI. It's really about where is it going to go from here. What I keep sort of nagging about is the easier place to go, where the politicians will go, is the front-facing customer transactional interfaces. Throw a clever AI bot on a service window, there's a place for that. I think the real potential of AI will be the traditionally hard to reform, sclerotic, bureaucratic parts of public sector, human resources and procurement and finance, the ability to augment those functions, so that people and money and information move around at a much faster pace, are actually quite exciting. So I think I tend to talk about it more as AI augmented. It's already happening to all of the professions. If you're a lawyer or a financial analyst or a wildlife biologist in Parks Canada, like it's there, and the applications, but we can't put a lot of clever AI use cases on a data system and information and records management, which is essentially rotted out. So, there has to be investment in the data strategy and the sort of the architectures and all the hard work of building the foundations on which, AI use cases can sit.
So again, those kind of getting the foundations right, that will be added to that list of issues that any incoming prime minister is going to have to deal with, I think.
Very much. And then you can learn from other countries. You can learn from Doge. A lot of that's not the way to do it. You can learn from the UK. You can learn from Germany, who have a big digital ambition and so on. And I think sharing these practices across countries and jurisdictions is actually an incredibly useful thing to do.
Thanks. I do want to get on to, because I did say that we would talk about some of the channels that Global Government Forum have in which some of the potential partners and suppliers could interact with policymakers as well. But before then, Michael, we have a couple of other policy related issues. I know you said there was very light on policy this campaign, but we've got two particular questions I want to ask you. So Thomas Daffern has said, what impact might the continuing crisis in Gaza and the relationship between Palestine and Israel have on the election? And is there a kind of sense of interference in the election with Netanyahu endorsing the Conservatives, for example? So is this an issue that Canadians should be calling out? Thomas has asked.
Well, I'm just watching the media flow by. It doesn't seem to have been a big issue. It certainly was an issue that roiled university campuses and communities last year. But it seems to have settled down, being one of many issues that people are concerned about. I'll defer to the political scientists. It's cut both ways. I read a piece the other day that says that Jewish voters have basically drifted to the conservatives, over the last year or two because they see Poilievre as more supportive of Israel's security and so on. But these would be very small numbers in overall 28 million votes that will be cast. So I don't want to dismiss the importance of the issue and how strongly people feel about it, but it's just going to be one of those things. We're not a big player in the Middle East, and Ukraine is by far a more important issue, from the Canadian perspective.
Yeah, thanks. So the other question was from Tanya King, and Tanya has said, why isn't anyone talking about Indigenous groups more? So, and Tanya says that Canada as a government still snubs our individual sovereignty, so of Indigenous groups, but these groups would fight to ensure the US could not attempt some sort of coup. So I'm going to ask you that, Michael. Are Indigenous groups, Indigenous voices being heard enough? And then Richard, Tanya has said also the UK should be taking the threat of 51st state much more seriously if they intend to continue benefiting from the resources that they currently enjoy. I can broaden that out. Should the rest of the world be taking this threat more seriously? Michael, I'll just come to you on the issue of Indigenous groups and Indigenous voices. Are they being heard enough, talked about enough in this election?
It's one of the many issues like climate change and others that have just basically been pushed to the side and will come back. I put it in that category. It hasn't gone away as an important issue, but it just hasn't been a big driver. I mean, I would Indigenous people are also individuals. They're voters. It's about 1.5 million, people. Half of those would be voting age adults. There are parts of the country where the Indigenous vote matters to the outcome. And Indigenous, Canadians will get to have some influence on the election. In the past, there's been a pattern of a lot of Indigenous people essentially not voting in federal elections, seeing it as somebody else's system. That has started to reverse. The political organizations are encouraging Indigenous Canadians to get out and vote, make a choice and support one or the other. And there will be Indigenous members of Parliament in the next legislature for sure. So, it will come back. All of the parties are saying they want to bring more resource projects on stream, whether it's mining of critical minerals, energy corridors, hydrogen and helium, all of this sort of stuff. So the issues we've been talking about for a decade or two about, consultation with Indigenous communities, what degree of consent's required, that will all come back, whoever is the government. And then, just the ongoing issues that, about 4 or 5% of Canadians are obviously face, whether it's housing, healthcare, aging population, all of those sorts of things. And, for our non-Canadian audience, about half of the people that self-identify as Indigenous in Canada live in our cities. The largest Indigenous community is Edmonton, and Winnipeg, Toronto, Vancouver, and so on. So there's a whole interesting mix of politics and policy around urban Indigenous people, similar to Australia, actually, which will be on the agenda of the next government. And I think both parties, in their own way, want to close socioeconomic gaps. They just have very different views about the right policy set to get there.
Okay, thanks, Michael. And Richard, the second half of that question was around, is the UK and other countries, I would broaden it out, taking the issue of, Trump keeps talking about Canada as the 51st state. Are we taking that seriously enough?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think Michael was very clear in his opening comments about the kind of the visceral impact that the Trump administration's comments have had on Canada. I mean, my kind of vantage point would be that there's kind of still slight sort of disbelief in other countries around the rhetoric. Obviously, Trump is President Trump is a very rhetorical animal, but not quite sure to what extent it will be reflected in action. Same with what's obviously happening around Greenland as well. There's not kind of, I think, governments are not quite sure how to respond, because it's slightly, out with the terms of what people thought the terms of trade were, of kind of international alliances and things like that. So I think there's the point has been received in a lot of capitals that America is different now, and I think we're seeing the reconfiguration of alliances to reflect that, and that we might not return to the status quo ante, but that, yeah, the kind of response to the individual elements of what that would mean for the sort of the nations not directly concerned, I think still needs developing. And there is an interesting thought experiment, of kind of if if America did attempt to annex Canada or Greenland, kind of what would the UK want to do in response? What would it wish it had to respond? Likewise, France, likewise other European countries. I think that's probably where the thinking is going to go next. Once these alliances are built, and Michael mentioned it earlier, one feels that your life is a constant search for a steady state that isn't going to happen. But once there's a little bit more kind of these international alliances are kind of set a little bit more in concrete, that I think it will be moving to, okay, if these things ever do happen, what would we need to do?
Yeah, thanks. And of course, for those who love the kind of details, there are the constitutional types of issues around the king being the head of state and issues like that as well, which I think would be a whole nother webinar, but very interesting and complex issues. Before we move on to some of those Global Government Forum challenges, I'll just pick up on something you mentioned in passing, Michael, which just very quickly I want your thoughts on. What's the likelihood, do you think, of no clear outcome from the election? And is that something that people, civil servants in particular, will be preparing for? So some kind of hung parliament?
I think there's a very, very small team at the Cabinet Office that will be, thinking about these scenarios, and it's certainly possible if some of the supporters of the smaller parties feel that the outcome is clear and they can comfortably drift back to their old allegiances and it won't matter, then you may end up with a bit of a surprise. First past the post is very fickle, very sensitive, as you know, and the range of outcomes is from cracking great majority to a minority, and then you have to do the math, which combinations would create a functional government or not. We could spend a lot of time speculating about that. I think the Cabinet Office people will be hoping that there's a clarity, even if it's a slim majority, that there's a functional government. Somebody has the ability to put things before Parliament with some certainty that they're going through. Most public servants are just going to watch this and see what happens and wait a week or two, find out who their minister is, and they keep calm, carry on, and deliver their current programs and functions until the next government decides to change something. And it's only as we see new laws, new policies, new institutions that people's day-to-day jobs will be affected. Just quickly on the Trump point, I mean, we're not expecting paratroopers in Ottawa, any day now. It's more a sense that he's going to be there 4 more years. We're only on day 95 of Trump, and he clearly has an agenda to hobble us, to weaken our ability, to defend ourselves and to weaken the economy. And so this may be a sort of a slow, gradual process that dominates the conversation in Canada for the next 2, 3, 4 years. And if the successor is Vance or Rubio, this may be the dominant issue for a decade in Canada.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, just to say to the audience, we've probably got about 10 minutes left. So now is your chance, your final chance to send in any questions or comments that you want to put to Michael and Richard. In the meantime, I just want to quickly, I did say we would, especially as I know we do have some private sector partners on the call, as well as some of our public sector colleagues. So just very quickly, some of you might not be familiar with Global Government Forum and all of the different ways in which you can work with us. I'm going to whip through this very quickly. So Raquel, if you could move to the next slide, that would be great. And the next one on that. So essentially, we are an organisation, as I said, we work with public servants all around the world. These are the types of things that we do. We run in-life conferences and summits. We do online events like these types of conversations, these types of webinars. We also do podcasts. We do research, we do bespoke research, people can commission us to do research, and we run training courses, as well as having a website that has lots and lots of really great information, including some which Michael very kindly contributes to. Next slide, please, Raquel. Why GGF? I think we're unique in that I think we're probably the only organisation that has this real global network of public servants around the world. We are always impartial in the things that we do, and you can see everything else there on the slide in terms of we run very trusted, very well received events all around the world. Next slide, please, Raquel. Just to say that's you can get a real snapshot. We can send you these slides afterwards, so I am rushing through these very quickly. But we do operate all around the world, and we have great networks with senior officials, senior managers, and specialists. Increasingly, we do a lot of work on the kind of digital transformation side of things. So we have a lot of civil servants and their private sector kind of colleagues who are working in the data technology, digital kind of side of things. Next slide, Raquel. And just to mention, I'm going to hand over to Richard because there is a very specific conference coming up in Canada which people might be interested in. So Richard, I'm going to hand over to you for that one.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Siobhan. Yes, Accelerate Gov is our big annual conference in Ottawa. It will return on the 9th of December. It's a one-day conference followed by the Global Government Digital Summit, where we bring together experts involved in digital transformation in governments around the world with Canadian public servants to set out some of the key elements of best practice, some of the thinking around how to harness technology and kind of innovative and transformative approaches more broadly in a conference event. We host that in partnership with the government of Canada, and you can see on that slide there the lists of the speakers who attended last year's event, sorry, I should say 2024. And it's one of my responsibilities here at GGF that I really enjoy to write that agenda, and that's why events like this one are so useful for me in helping to kind of understand the priorities of the incoming government and the issues that people are raising in questions and things like that. So yes, we will be running Accelerate Gov in December, and we will be working to ensure that the agenda reflects the priorities of the new government, whoever that is, and it's really providing a useful forum for public servants to have the skills and expertise and international inspiration to deliver for the next administration.
Thanks, Richard. And all the details there are on the slide if you are interested in being part of that event. Raquel, I think we have one or two slides left just to say there are some of the webinars that we have coming up. But if you go on the Global Government Forum website, you'll see all of the information about all of the other webinars we have coming up. Similarly, I think next site, we've got a whole load of training. Please do take a look that you and your teams might be interested in. I think that is it. So there we go. There is the contact information. As I say, we'll send these slides around so you've got all of that contact information. Thanks so much, Raquel. And we do have one question that is still open. I'm going to broaden this question a little bit, but I think it's a really tricky question. I'm not making it easy for you to your last. It might be the last question, but if anyone else has another question, send it in now because this will be the last chance you have. Nakashu asked a question at the beginning. Do the panel believe a red ocean strategy would be a more viable approach than compete on prices to minimize any fallout in sales from key industries impacted by the trade war? I'm going to broaden that question a little bit and just say, because I think this is what so many world leaders around the world are going to be thinking with is how do you respond to this kind of trade war? What's your best response? Richard, I'll come to you very quickly and then the final word to you, Michael, on this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're seeing, I think Michael mentioned that kind of Team Canada approach in Canada. You are seeing kind of the beginnings of kind of Buy British approaches in the UK, where kind of people are slightly concerned about the potential impact of the trade war. But it is really difficult for governments to deal with because the US is the kind of economic hegemon of the age, and they've decided to throw their weight about, for want of a better phrase, and it's really difficult to for governments to decide what to do with that. They are trying now to minimize the economic impact by kind of I don't think the tariffs well, in the UK, for example, they haven't levied any additional tariffs yet. I think other countries are looking to levy them on kind of politically inconvenient industries in the hope of kind of getting some politicians' attention. But not to the same scale as they are being levied on them by the US. It's obviously there's going to be a lot of investment in alternative areas of alternative products where they can be done. For example, defense spending. I know that you've seen countries beginning to move away from US suppliers or looking if they can get out of some deals and moving to kind of other national countries. So yeah, it's a long it's a difficult process to manage because we might be unwinding 60 years of economic history, and you can't do that even in a term or two, as Michael said. Even if this is a decade-long paradigm, you know, we might not have unraveled everything by the end of it.
Thanks, Richard. And Michael, the last word to you, and Thomas has just come in as well to add in, what about Five Eyes and the probability that Trump is a Russian asset? Has this been discussed in Canada? And again, I think you could broaden that out. It's these new alliances, isn't it? And where does Trump's sympathies lie? Even if you don't think he's necessarily a Russian asset, is he kind of more Russian friendly than previous presidents have been? So final words to you, Michael, and just how does Canada respond to all of this coming out of the US?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to comment on the latter. I lost my security clearance when I left government 6 years ago, so I don't know what they're thinking. But I mean, I would say we're into an age of ever shifting alliances, you know, around different topics and different issues. My metaphor would be the Harry Potter staircases in Hogwarts, and you know, not a fixed cast. There are kind of three broad buckets. There are economic relationships and financial relationships, which will, you know, flow down certain channels, and there may be pivots in the sort of trading and financial relationships. There are the defense, security, intelligence ones, which are not, you know, they overlap, but they're not exactly the same. The future of NATO, the future of North American defense. Canada's an Asian Pacific country, and we have a lot of common interests with Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So there's a whole Pacific side of it for Canada. And last but not least, you know, there is this sense of, you know, a small band of democratic countries with open societies and free and fair elections, of which there are only about, you know, 20 or so left. And, you know, we still, well, you know, it's worth the struggle for human rights and open societies and you know, dignity of people and and democratic governance. And so we can find common cause with other democratic and open societies around the world. So, you know, between the sort of democracy agenda, the security agenda, the economic agenda, and all of the other big drivers like climate change and AI, may you live in interesting times. It's going to call on the best energy and talents of all of us, those that work in the public sector for sure, but frankly, all of us.
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much. What a brilliant way to end, I think. I'd like to say a huge thanks to the audience for sending in so many great questions. Thank you for making that a real conversation throughout that time today. We will send a link to everyone who registered today and everyone who joined us live so that you can watch the video again or share it with colleagues. And we'll also send a short write-up of the conversation as well in a short while. I think we might send out a very short questionnaire to everyone who registered today. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill that in, I would be hugely grateful just to make sure we keep giving you webinars on the topics that are of most interest to you. So I'd be really grateful for that. But I want to say a massive thanks to Michael and to Richard for lending us their time. Michael in particular, I know it's a really busy time for you, but I think a really good way to end there, as you say, in amongst all of this craziness that's going on, one thing to celebrate is you are now going to have a free and fair election. So to everyone in Canada, I hope that's a successful election for you, whatever that means for you. And maybe we will come back a short time after the election and see what the outcome of that has been. Thanks to everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are, and I hope to see you again very soon in another one of our conversations.
Thank
Thanks
you
so
so
much.
much, Siobhan. Cheers,
Bye-bye.
everybody.